don't mind, I'm going to undress a little bit here. This costume has, over the years, become a part of me, and so every once in a while I like to shed a bit of it. So, but you didn't see, this was typical 17th century fashion, not of the upper class, but of the middle class back then. And for the Hurd house, the date is 1680, so we are dealing with the 17th century. And that's part of what the herb garden here is all about. So the use of plants in daily living has its origins in our primitive history, with experience passed from generation to generation. So let me quickly take you back to the early 17th century and two particular men, John Gerard and Nicholas Culpeper. Gerard was a doctor, he was a surgeon, and the surgeon was also a barber. And of his day, he wrote an herbal, and people had been dealing with herbs going back to primitive times. We know that the early Etruscans and the Greeks and the Romans and all through the Middle Ages, the importance of growing herbs and learning how to use them was just an intimate part of daily life. So Gerard was one of the first who began to put it into small booklets. Mr. Gerard, 17th century. Mr. Culpeper, 17th century. Two very important people in regards to the understanding of herbs. Now, Culpeper, with a background in Latin and theology and a strong desire to serve mankind, he was an extraordinary apothecary, and he translated the medical texts of his time to be used in the universities and among the physicians in England. He produced many medical texts, many booklets, and tried to translate them for the common man. And so we owe a great deal to Mr. Culpeper as bringing the lore of the herbs along for the understanding of the everyday person. Now, many of his booklets we still find, bits and pieces of them. They're difficult to read, and one of the fun things for me over the years has been to collect various books on herbs, and the first two were the Culpeper books, and the first one is, this is the common one, but I did come across one that was fun. And this one, it's all been translated into everyday English. And so one of the things for the Hurd house was to understand not only the growing of the herbs, but the uses of the herbs. So, now, Mr. Culpeper was concerned that the physicians were exploiting the common man and making them get cures that weren't necessary and whatever. So that was one of his reasonings for translating the Latin understanding of the herbs into the common language. And he explained the cultivation, the description, and the uses of the plants for both medicine and for their virtues. And this is one thing when you deal with the 17th century that you have to kind of get your head around and understand. Virtues were God endowed plants with virtues that would be beneficial for mankind. And so this was also very important for the growing, because as I tell the children, there's no Stop and Shop, there's no ShopRite, there's no CVS, there's none of this. This is passed down from generation to generation, the uses and the understanding of these plants and how they would be a part of your everyday life and your family, taking care of your family and yourself as well. Now, sometimes he did a little astrology. Back then, that was also an important part of being able to read the stars, so things are a little bit different than our modern times, although we still have astrologers out there. And all of this became intertwined with the uses of the herbs. Sometimes his thoughts were right on target, and sometimes they were really irrational, so when we go back and read his treatises. So. But he felt that each man could become his own physician. And in an agrarian society, it was understood there was a relationship between the growth of crops, the seasons, the animals, and behavior. And the herbal was a bestseller at 3d a copy and began coming to the New World from England by the second half of the 17th century. So it was being brought over by the ships as trade began. So his herbals were used up until the 19th century. They were just as important then. So, and oftentimes at a tag sale or whatever, you can come across these old books that are just stashed away, and so find these little treatises all over the place. This is medical herbs needed today, and this is from the early part of the 1900s. So you have descriptions and uses and whatever. And I had a grandfather who made his own medicines and made teas all the time and treated himself. So for medicine, people believed that the body contained 4 cardinal humors, or your tempers: blood, phlegm, black cholera, or bile, and yellow bile. And many colorful adjectives find their way into our vocabulary today. So we still use sanguine. Those people are usually cheerful and beneficial, and that happens from bloodletting, although I can't quite figure out how that one is done, but as I say, some things were very irrational. Phlegmatic, that's sluggish, you're sluggish or slow. Caloric, and you're irascible and very ill-tempered. And of course melancholic, which is a preponderance of black bile with symptoms of great depression. There were 4 elements in nature, and these acted upon the humors and produced conditions in a person. And fire would be you had hot and dry persona. Air, which is windy. Water, which is moist. And earth, which is full of minerals. And herbs and plants not only have virtues, but they have these strengths for treatment. There were herbs to purge for sweats, vomit, and going to stool, even sneezing, which was often known as bleeding, purging, and puking. And you find those words all over the place, so they were very common back then. So add to this the idea, which was called the doctrine of signatures. And that says that God created the world for man's use and marked many plants by blossom, color, root, their leaf shapes, or in some way giving you a clue to help you know what they might be used for. Now again, there are some of them that are right on the mark, and there are others that are absolutely ridiculous. So it's been fun over the years to see how, these things came about. So It was customary for the Puritan housewife to have her fenced garden. Now, there were no gardens around the house, and that's what is fascinating for the Hurd house and for the wonderful job that the garden club has done for us. There would have been no landscaping, and at the time when the house was being refitted to become the house that it is now, they decided that perhaps a herb garden might be a good way to do landscaping there, since the animals would have run loose and they would have cropped whatever grass and you would have walked over it and whatever. And this, I need to go back quickly to tell you, this was the center of town, not down there. Those were all farms in that direction. This is the common green here. The meeting house was at the top of Hollow Road, and all of the importance went on within this area. So, but the early houses just didn't have landscaping. So, the idea was perhaps to wonder what the women who came to start Woodbury from Stratford would have brought with them for a kitchen garden. And the kitchen garden would not have been very far from the house. And the housewife was expected to raise everything she needed for her many jobs as a housewife and as a mother, and also as the physician to her family. So plants for dye, repellents, poisons, strong food seasonings, disinfectants, and air fresheners, childbirth aids, and the laying out of the dead were all important things that would have been in her garden for her everyday use. And of course the medicinal herbs for the health of her family. Now, doctors were scarce back then. Ministers had some knowledge, that physicians would have had, to heal the body and the mind. And if a doctor did come to, say, Miss Goodwife Hurd's house, he expected her to have on hand a good supply of simples and warts. And here's another terms that when you become an herbalist that you begin to understand. A simple is a single herb for an expected cure, and a wart is a root or a plant used in common diagnosis for fever, cough, the flu, flux, vomit. So simples and warts, those two terms you hear very often when you go back to learn about the early uses of the herbs. Your measurements, when you read, now often the lore was passed from mother to daughter as to how to use these for every day within your family life. So your measurements certainly would not have been a cup or a teaspoon or a tablespoon. You might have had a bite, which was the size of a walnut, or enough to put on the end of a knife. A little bunch of this, a pinch of that. So that's when you go back, and if anybody wrote any of these down, you will often see the measurements that are in those descriptive terms. Now, she may or may not have owned an herbal, such as a small treatise. Most likely it was passed down from her mother, and she would pass it on to her daughter. But the herbal, of course, was a small book of cures, and for common complaints, those cures she usually learned from her mother and passed on to her daughter. So things are a little bit different back then, and of course we don't presume to be the physician for our house, whereas Mrs. Hurd would have had to do that. So now she kept a simples closet usually, and it was well stocked. And across the back of the Hurd house, at one time, it was a salt box, and very much like the Glebe house. The Glebe house is 100 years later than the Hurd house, and the L across the back of the house has been taken off. When it was put on, about 1718, the middle section would have become the big kitchen with the big walk-in fireplace. The kitchen that we have now is known as the hall of the house, an old medieval term. And the fireplace is adequate, but it certainly is not the big walk-in one that you're accustomed to seeing in salt boxes. And so on the north end, or the cool end of that lean-to, would have been a small room that was known as the buttery, and it was cool and usually was laid out with stones on the floor, and she might have had her still room there, and that's where she kept her herbs. She prepared simple medicines and the regular cures that she knew. Now, many herbs were for toothache, and the local barber or the blacksmith performed extractions, and visitors to the colonies often described the residents, especially the women, as being tooth-shaken. And so by the age of 30, most women had lost most of their teeth. And much was due to sugar in the form of molasses, and their herbs for cooking, they were not gourmet, so you have to remember that there was a pot usually going on all the time in the fireplace, and which you added to it, and you might have had, a spider to cook maybe pork fat or whatever, but mostly you just kept adding to that pot. And in the fall, if there was harvest time, you might have had pork, and then that would be salted for the winter, or you might have gone out hunting and come back with a deer and had venison, but mostly it was an ongoing pot all the time. So, but sugar, sweet, so you had this big divide between what they liked. Molasses was really big one. White sugar you don't find much. I don't know if many of you have seen the sugar cones. That was, you save that for the minister. That was really top of the line stuff. So your everyday sweeteners would have been most likely molasses, and then perhaps maple syrup at the winter time. But molasses was the big one. So things were candied all the time. Roots were candied. And I planted one called Ilicopene, which is right outside the door here, because the roots were dug up and they were candied in molasses water. And they were used as a cure for the strangest of things, but they were also used as a candy. So we do not have a big kitchen garden of herbs. We have just their most favorite ones, which would be thyme, sage, sorrel, sometimes rosemary. So our garden, which is right outside the door on the backside here, would have been for kitchen usage. And as you can see, it's when it's restored, it will not be very big. But it will have such things as Egyptian onions. Onions were a big flavoring back then. But not in the way that we're accustomed to thinking about gourmet cooking with herbs and the comeback that herbs have made, in our time. So.
No salt and pepper?
Well, yeah. Well, it's the big thing for cooking would have been spices more than the herbs. So yes, you'd have had salt and pepper, which would be considered spices, of course, and nutmegs and other things along those lines. And that they were used in cooking. But when you read the recipes, it's really, when we're cooking here at the Hurd house, we have to kind of figure out how to make things palatable as compared to the old recipes. So. Now, to the pot or the kettle was added in season dried pumpkins, turnips, parsnips, onions, cabbage, roots, and leaves. And They didn't have fresh salads like we do. They had cooked salads, known as salads. But oftentimes your blossoms on your herbs and your flowers would be added to those cooked salads. So, but that was more common, not the fresh use of your greens, but oftentimes they were cooked in the fire. So, and of course there were stews and what they call spoon meats and ragouts and whatever herbs that you liked, sage or thyme or whatever, was sprinkled in those for flavorings for them. Now, delicate flavors were lost in that type of cooking. And most cooking herbs, were deliberately sharp and strong. They developed a taste for disagreeably sharp and bitter. And like seasonings, things that we just would not tolerate at all. So, and of course, as we just said, the spicers played a much bigger part in the cooking aspect of living in a 17th century house. But that's another subject altogether. So, now the Hurd house garden was designed at the time that the house was being put back into what everyone thought it was. And it had been there forever and ever. It was last owned by the blacksmiths and the flower shop. Next door is an 18th century blacksmith shop of one of the owners of the Hurd house. The Hurd house is really unusual in that it's not one house, but it's two complete houses that have been joined together. And the north house is the original house as far as we know, and we date it at 1680 because it's listed on the probate records of the town at 1680. It was probably begun 1670s, thereabout. That's when people began flocking to Woodbury. And of course, John Hurd was a very important individual because he was the miller for the town. And since this was the center of the town, you were given between 2 and 10 acres of land for your house lot along usually an Indian trail. And the whole of Hollow Road coming down and all the way behind the cemetery and out to Laban's was the old Indian trail. And so this would have been just the right place to begin with settlement of the town. So John Hurd, because he's the miller, and you ate grain at every meal, so you're talking about your oatmeals and your mushes and your that type of thing. So it was very important to be able to have someone who could grind the grain into your flour. And John Hurd and his father had been millers in the town of Stratford that they came from. And as an incentive, they offered him 10 acres of land, here what we know as the Hollow, to build his house on along the Indian Trail, and he accepted. And his mill was probably out in that direction and used the power of the river to turn the wheel to grind the grain for the big grindstones. And this was where he built his house. And the north side, as I said, is the first house. And the second house, he had after he died about 1690, his wife was still there and his daughter, and he had grandsons and children and whatever, and they were all there, and they sort of outgrew the first part of that house. And they got another house that most likely belonged to John Hurd's brother, although we don't know for certain, and we think it couldn't have been too far away, but it was very common. The other house was simply picked up off its foundation. If it was summertime, it was rolled down here on logs. If it was winter, it was pulled on sleds, pushed up against the first house, expanded the stack of the chimney to serve the second house, and that's the Hurd house that you see now. And so at that particular time, it would have been about 1715, 1718. So for the outside, that's what you see. But when you go into the north side of the house, that's the one that we try to show you, and also on the south, what it was like to live in a 17th century house. So the garden, as I said, was deemed to be perhaps an herb garden, and we could use it as a teaching garden. So, and that was under the auspices of Mrs. Sylvia Strong, and there was a group of 7 very important individuals at the time of the purchase of the Hurd house, and each one of them was skilled in some aspect of restoration work. And they all got together, although they argued a lot from what I understand, and did the reconstruction of the house to what you see now. And Mrs. Strong was responsible for the gardens. And that time, most everyone knew who Adelmason was. And so Mrs. Strong contacted her and told her what was happening here. And they talked about the garden and said how, they wanted to deal with the very early settlement of the house, and what herbs did she think that they might have brought from Stratford. And so it was Adelma who put together the idea of what these gardens would contain and somewhat what they would look like. So, and that's the landscaping of the house we have. And that's why we're just so grateful for the Garden Club and what you've done, because it's a very important aspect of this town in the 17th century, and understanding the material and social culture of what it was like. People, we all know about the Revolution, and we all know about the wonderful, the clothing and all the rest of it. But to me, the great challenge was to try and figure out what it was like for people to live here in the 17th century when they came up from Stratford. And they were in the 3rd generation in Stratford. Most all the settlement of Connecticut is all along the shore, and then Wethersfield. This is the frontier. This is an early town. There was nothing between Stratford and Albany until they came to Woodbury. So all of these things, to me, just were kind of mind-blowing in a way, because, you just take for granted. You go to Plymouth, you go to Williamsburg, you go to Sturbridge. We've got it right here in the hollow. And the houses and the setup of the land and everything else is here. And that's why we thought to continue the herb garden for the Hurd house was so important, because of that whole aspect of what we have right here in the hollow in terms of history, and then of course along our main street. But this was the center of town right here. So Adelma came up with all the ideas for the herbs that could be used here. And of course she, at that time, was known as the Queen Mother of Herb Gardens. Everyone went to her. She had started in the 1920s. At the time of the Depression, she had a really good job as a store publicity person, purchasing agent, and which was unusual for a woman. But she and her family were a little bit worried when the Depression set in as to how they were going to take care of themselves. And they bought an old goat farm, which was christened Camperlands in Coventry, and set about turning it into gardens. And somehow, and goats, but somehow she just thought that it wasn't quite right for her. But she sort of got herself into understanding herbs, and that, like so many of us, just fascinated her. And 50 years worth of working her way through the most beautiful gardens, and the accumulation of the lore and the uses and everything else. And at that time, at the restorations would be 1967, that's the person that you went to. I spent a great deal of time going up to Camperlands. I don't know how many of you did. She used to have put on luncheons all the time. Everything revolved around the use of these herbs. And because when I found out that she was part of the background and restoration of this garden, I wanted to know all that she could tell me, and she was wonderful. She helped me a great deal to begin to understand something. And I'm not a gardener, but what I discovered with herbs is they're kind of like me. You don't have to do a lot to them. They don't mind bad soil. They don't have to be watered all the time, and they just absolutely blossom. If you have reasonable years, you just have wonderful herbs. And that's to me, they became something that I thoroughly enjoyed beginning to research the background on for that. So quickly, some of the herbs, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what the 17th century people thought that they were used for. So we have lamb's ears, and those are in the front of the garden, and they're all furry. They were sometimes used as Band-Aids, but they were also used in their salads and cooked to eat. So sometimes I kind of think they're a little furry, so we don't usually cook them up. So now comfrey. I brought in a comfrey leaf. There's a big plant out there, right here. Oh, yeah. This was known as knit bone. And you would boil the roots and make a thick juice that will glue things together. And do you know that it works for bones?
Yeah.
You will often find comfrey is used in some of the medicines because it does just that. So there's one of the ones that Culpepper stumbled on that actually has some reality to it. So it was used for wounds and burns and bruises. And mostly what their medicines would have been teas. They would have made teas or poultices, things like that. So you could also use comfrey for a restful sleep if you wanted, and brew a nice tea. And science, as I said, still supports some of these claims on that particular herb for comfrey. Now calendulas, we know them more as marigolds, but the calendulas, the real calendulas that they would have had are really pretty. They're like big buttercups. They're not spiky flowers, they're big flat flowers. And they were used for dyes and for cloth. And the yellow was, you wash your hair with it, rinse your hair with it, so brighten your hair up. So. Teasel. I meant to grab one. Teasel's a biennial, so you only get it every 2 years. And this became a very important herb for growth here in Woodbury because it wasn't too long after the settlers arrived here that they began to bring in sheep. And there were huge sheep farms all over the place. And of course that was the start of some of the mills with the clothing along the river and whatever. And teasel is used to full wool. And so that's to raise the pile of wool. So that's one of the things we absolutely had to have because we know that there were sheep out here. They were brought by ship from England, and it wasn't long before there were sheep everywhere. So. Mullins. Now we think of those as big weeds, but the dried flowers or the stalks are often dipped in oil and used as a torch. So. Horehound. We still use horehound for cough drops, and so did they. Teas and syrups for bad coughs. And parsley you chewed for fresh breath, and it contains a lot of vitamin C. And roses were used for everything. Of course, the rose hips also contain a lot of vitamin C. They like the smell. They used it for flavor. I see more and more now rose hips oil of roses is coming back into cooking. In the last 5 years, you see more of that along with the orange, and you'll see the rose flavor. Lady's mantle. That is in our garden, and most of these are in the garden here, or will be in the garden. And I forgot I was going to bring a piece of lady's mantle. We lost ours here, but I have one at home, and it's kind of a brown leaf, and it was a signature herb for female complaints. For some reason, they thought it looked like parts of the female. So, and lungwort is another signature herb, and I don't know if you've seen lungwort. It is sort of green, about maybe that long. Has all those spots over it, kind of purpley spots, and they thought it looked like a lung. So,
Pomenaria, is that it?
Pardon me?
Pomenaria?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just like-
And I apologize to you that the Latin, trying to make sense out of remembering the Latin words over remembering all the different herbs, it's, every once in a while one does stick out, but, so the lungwort was for all chest ailments and coughs and wheezing. Foxgloves. Now, Gerard and Culpeper, despite it being a source of digitalis, did not know of any help for cardiac problems. So, but they thought they used it to purge for phlegm and for clammy humors and even a scabby head. So, but we did discover that for heart medicines, that digitalis, which comes from foxgloves, is an important medicine. Feverfew. It looks like small daisies, and feverfew was used as an aspirin and would be used today in summer for syrups. And you usually made a good batch of it for the winter. White willow. I'm sure that many of you know what willow will give you, and some don't. Aspirin comes from willow. And they knew that the barks and flowers boiled into a tea worked really well for headaches. But it was also good as a face wash. And it was good for diarrhea. And it was good for dysentery. But the bark is the one that contains the aspirin, the acetylsalicylic acid, when you boil it, for headaches. Sorrel. I love sorrel. We cook with sorrel, and that's usually in our cooking garden there, and it kind of has a sour taste, but it adds a really nice thing to stews and soup meats. So that one is actually more of a culinary herb. Gilly flowers. Now gilly flowers, you'd call them dianthus or pinks. They called them gilly flowers, and they were good for your brain. And of course you have thyme, and that's another cooking herb. But you'd also use that in your teas because of the thymol. It's a strong antiseptic, and it's good for coughs. And the tea will make a shy person have courage. Now, sage, of course, you ate in the spring as a tonic. And it was used to heal as an antibiotic. And it's also good for the brain, and it increases your memory. So if any of you like sage, keep that in mind. So, it'll whiten your teeth. And it's good to darken your hair. Now rosemary. Rosemary was a beloved herb, and it goes all the way back to medieval times. The song Rosemary and Thyme, all the rest of it. But for them, it was just one of their most favorite herbs. And it had to have been a favorite herb for over 3,000 years. We've gone back that far and find evidence of the use of rosemary. And it certainly was grown in every English garden. But it's too cold in New England to grow rosemary through the winter. And so you'd have to pot it. And boy, you tend it very gently through the winter, so to make sure that you had it ready for the spring. And it was used in salads, and often used with both meat and fish, and which we still do today. And to give a sprig of rosemary was a sign of friendship. And of course the tea was supposed to be wonderful for your teeth and your gums, and for bad breath as well. And sniffing it was another one that was good for the brain. And a strewing herb. Now strewing herbs are very important, and they're around the front door of the Hurd house. How many of you use air fresheners? That's what strewing herbs are for. You would throw them on the floor, and as you walked on them, Most of them have a rather strong antiseptic kind of smell, and it releases the smell and it freshens your house. So they were an important aspect of your garden. Southern wood, the same was a strewing herb, and southern wood is along the front part of the garden out there. It was good also for bruises. Now, all of these herbs have multiple uses, which to me was fascinating. Very few of them have just one use. They have multiple uses for all kinds of things, and then that's when we Culpeper and Mr. Gerard, you find these things out all the time. So, but how much of it is lore, how much of it was passed down, how much of it was decided is anybody's guess. Tansy, which is by the door, back door here, was used for cooking, but it's really bitter for cooking, so we don't use it very often. But it repels ants and fleas, and oftentimes you'll find it around an entrance to a house. As a tea, it was really good to fasten loose teeth, and it could ease a toothache at the same time. And it was used for childbirth ailments and to preserve meat. And it was also rubbed on the dead as a preservative. And many times, in a wooden coffin or whatever, you'll pack tansy all around the body. Supposedly was a preservative. There are stories where it apparently worked, though. Lavender, another stewing herb, and we all know lavender. It was used in wash water. It was a tick repellent. It was good for a headache. And you put it under your pillow for a good night's sleep. And that's come back into favor. So. And of course for our sachets and our perfumes. Bee balm. The settlers learned that from the native peoples, the Oswego Indians. And they learned to make a fragrant tea with that. And it later became one of the many liberty teas during the Revolution when the colonists would not buy the tea from England and made their own teas. And so bee balm was one of those things that, and of course it's a flavoring for bergamot or tea today. So we know it as bergamot, not bee balm. Hens and chickens. And perhaps because of the abundance of juice in those plants and their tissues, that was thought to contain magic to warn off lightning. And house leeks became very important, and they often were found growing on roofs. And of course, wormwood is very bitter, and it was supposed to be good for worms. And some gardens had woad in them, and that's a source of blue dye. Now, some of the herbs of superstition is wolfbane. Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf. The wolfbane blooms, and the autumn moon is bright. So be careful. Be careful with heliotrope. And we have heliotrope in the garden. It's beautiful, but it follows the sun, and it warns with its bitter scent. It warns you of vampires in the area. Now, lovage we use a lot in cooking because it's like celery. The flavor of celery, it smells like celery. Works like celery when you're using it for cooking. But they thought it was good for digestion, and perhaps it is. And it certainly was supposed to be good for your complexion, so make a wash water with it. I haven't tried that with celery, nor have I tried it with the lovage, but it sounds interesting. If you're not a gardener at all, the next time you take a ride in our beautiful state, pay attention to the weeds that you see along the roadside. There are many what we call escaped herbs that were once in a housewife's garden. daylilies, mulleins, Queen Anne's lace, which is the forerunner of our carrot, dandelions, henbane, yarrow, buttercups, St. John's worts, assorted mints, speedwell, sorrel. These aren't weeds. These are the history. So enjoy the past alive in our present. I'm sure like many of you, I collect books and we're doing the research and whatever. And we were just looking at the one that has the Camperlands garden in there, and you don't know if you're familiar. It's no longer what it was, and it's really sad because she was really a spectacular person, a really interesting character to talk with and to learn from, and to go up and to visit her farm, and it has fallen into disrepair. And they're still trying to figure out, the town of Coventry is trying to figure out what to do with it, so. But wonderful things with herbs from Williamsburg, so for, more modern things. So. And of course the culpepper, I have the early book, and this is not the earliest. To try and read the earliest is just about near impossible. This is not too bad, and this one is much better. So. But I have two favorite books, and if you are interested in herbs, I'm going to just recommend them to you. One is this one, and it is all photographs, and really the descriptions of them are really very, very good. So if you're at all interested just in adding to your collection of knowledge of flowers, and most all of them are in here. So, and I have used this over and over and over again to learn about what I'm looking for. Pardon me?
Who wrote that?
This is Leslie Brennis. I spent a lot of time up at Plymouth Plantation, and I got to know John Forte up there when he was the head horticulturist there, and he recommended these for me when I was doing research, trying to put the garden together. And this one as well. And this one I use all the time, so it has not only the herbs in it, but also what you can do with them. It's how to make some of the teas, and it certainly tells you about cultivation of them and how to take care of them.
Who's the same author? Are they both the same author?
This is, no, this is, well, you can come look at
Patricia
these.
Turcotte.
Yeah, on that one.
Thank you.
But these two books are really the ones, when I'm not doing research, when I'm dealing with the herbs themselves, that I use the most. So I thought I'd bring them along. So. And there were a couple of interesting ones. One was done by the Colonial Dames that just has the lore in it, which is this one, Simple Superstitions and Solace, and another Simples and Mores, that just collections of the lore that go along with these herbs. So, thank you for having me, and thank you to the Garden Club for all their wonderful work. It just has been so much.
Thank you very much. I just want to tell you also one little tidbit. The house across the street is where our garden club was founded in 1927. So, and we think that maybe Sylvia Strong was a member
But she
of the
was a member
garden
of the
club.
Garden Club.
So Marty was going to look through the history a little.
Yeah, someday.
Was there any questions that anybody had? Yeah.
Mr. Culpepper came from England,
Yes.
so he did all his research on her herbs there. So it was used here, though. So was there a lot here that weren't in England, right?
Oh. Have you got just half a second?
Sure.
This to me was fascinating. This is called Mort's Relation. This is letters that were sent by Edward Winslow, one of the first Puritans, back to England to try and get people to come, to tell them the good things that were there. And he said, the land for the crust of the earth is wonderful The depth is excellent, the black mold and soil and everything else is. And then he says that there are great oaks, pines, walnuts, beech, ash, birch, hazel, holly, sassafras in abundance, and vines everywhere, cherry trees, plums trees, and many others which we don't know, and many kinds of herbs we found here in winter, as strawberry leaves, innumerable amounts, sorrel, yarrow, carvel. I have yet to find out what that one is.
Ice cream.
Yes, ice cream. Right. Brookline, liverwort, watercresses, and a great store of leeks and onions, and excellent strong kinds of flax and hemp.
I'd come, wouldn't you?
Right. So, I mean, so many things were brought from England, like your rosemaries and the pinks and that type of thing. But there were things here. You know that there were no apple trees here, only crab apples. We still have those amongst along the roads, but no